Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty pretty big and complicated.
Yeah.
The Trump administration's immigration policies.
Right.
We're going to really try and zero in on how these policies affected two immigrant communities, specifically Indian immigrants and Ethiopian immigrants.
We've been looking at, news reports and analyses, just trying to figure out, like, not just what the policies were, kind of on paper, but what they actually meant for, people and families in these communities.
And what we want to try and do for you guys listening is go a little bit deeper than the headlines and give you like a clear picture
Yeah.
of how these policies change things, and what the actual tangible effects were for Indian and Ethiopian immigrants here in the U.S.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's jump right in and let's start with the Indian immigrant experience.
Sure.
One of the really key things here is the H-1B visa program. Can you
Right.
talk a little bit about why this particular visa is so important for Indian professionals?
So the H-1B is like the main way that skilled foreign professionals come to the U.S. to work, especially in fields like technology and engineering.
Right.
And Indian professionals have really benefited from this program, historically, and they filled lots of, important roles in the American economy.
Yeah, and during the Trump administration, there were a bunch of proposed changes and increased scrutiny around this H-1B visa.
Yeah, definitely.
What did that look like specifically, and what were some of the challenges that it posed for Indian nationals who, really depend on this pathway?
Well, it was interesting because the administration kind of shifted its approach.
Okay.
They started really focusing on stricter enforcement, like reviewing applications much more carefully.
Mhm.
And they said they wanted to prioritize like higher wage jobs and super specialized positions.
Right.
And while, their stated goal was to protect American jobs, all of this extra scrutiny and, the possibility of stricter requirements, it really made a lot of Indian nationals nervous. I mean, they were worried it was going to be way harder to get these visas and, that could really mess with their careers. And in some cases, it even meant people might have to leave the U.S.
Right, and so building on, that reliance on the H-1B for entry,
Yeah.
our sources also talk about like a hardening of stance towards people who are already in the U.S. but without authorization.
Right.
There's been this increase in deportations.
Yeah.
One thing that really stood out to me was this report of 104 Indian nationals being deported on a military plane in February of 2025.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit? Like, what's the significance there?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it in the context of this like ramped up enforcement by IC immigration and customs enforcement,
Right.
this particular event really shows how much more assertive they were being about removing people who didn't have legal status.
Yeah.
Using a military plane for a deportation that big, it really drew a lot of criticism about how those deportees were being treated.
Mhm.
And it just highlights, how vulnerable undocumented Indian immigrants were during that time.
Right, right. And then you have this other really complicated issue, which is the green card backlogs.
Yeah.
And it seems like some of the policy changes during this period actually made that situation even worse,
Yeah.
especially for Indian families. So how did that happen?
Well, it's really all about how these different immigration policies kind of interact. So there was talk of revoking work authorization for H-4 visa holders. Now, these are often the spouses of H-1B workers, and a lot of them are from India.
Uh-huh.
And that created a ton of anxiety because if they lose the ability to work, not only does it put financial pressure on families, but it could force them to make really tough choices about staying in the U.S. long term.
Right.
And that would just make the green card backlogs even worse.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
just so much uncertainty, about their legal status and their financial situation. And that can lead to some real instability.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit now and talk about the impact on Ethiopian immigrants. One of the key things mentioned in our sources is this temporary protected status, or TPS,
Mm-hmm.
that was granted to Ethiopia back in October 2022.
Right.
For anyone who's not familiar, can you just quickly explain what TPS is and why it was such a big deal for Ethiopians in the U.S. at that time?
Sure. So TPS, or temporary protected status, is like this temporary immigration benefit. It's
Mhm.
given to people from certain countries that are going through really tough times that make it dangerous for them to go back home.
Right,
Things like armed conflicts, natural disasters, those kinds of situations.
right.
When Ethiopia got TPS in 2022, it meant that Ethiopians who were already here in the U.S. could stay and work legally for a certain period of time. And
Yeah.
that gave them, a much needed sense of security and stability.
Right.
It's actually based on specific parts of the Immigration and Nationality Act. And it's meant to offer like a temporary safe haven when there are these really serious emergencies happening.
Yeah. So even though Ethiopia was granted TPS, Our sources also talk about this lingering uncertainty because of the administration's broader immigration policies.
Yeah.
So what were the specific concerns about the future of TPS for Ethiopians?
It's really interesting because on the one hand, you have this humanitarian crisis and you're trying to help by granting TPS. But on the other hand, you have this general policy direction that's all about limiting immigration.
Right.
So even though Ethiopia got this protection, the administration was sending all these signals that they weren't really keen on extending or expanding these temporary protections long term.
Uh-huh.
And that created a lot of anxiety for Ethiopians with TPS because their long-term future in the U.S. was still up in the air.
Yeah, absolutely. Another really important area for Ethiopian immigrants, and actually for a lot of other nationalities too, was refugee admissions.
Yeah.
Our sources say there was a pretty big reduction in the total number of refugees allowed into the U.S. during this time.
Definitely.
How did this specifically affect Ethiopians who were trying to find refuge in the U.S.?
Well, if you link it back to the administration's focus on border security and their goal of lowering overall immigration numbers, you can see how the big decrease in refugee admissions really limited the options for Ethiopians trying to escape conflict or instability in their home country.
Yeah.
They just weren't as many resettlement spots available. And that impacted not just individuals, but also families and communities who often rely on support and money sent back from relatives who might have been hoping to come here.
Right. Okay, so let's zoom out a bit and look at some of the bigger impacts on immigrant communities in general,
Okay.
both Indian and Ethiopian immigrants.
Yeah.
One thing that keeps coming up is this increase in enforcement by ICE.
Yeah, for sure.
What did that actually look like on the ground, and how did it affect these communities?
Well, with ICE being so much more active, it meant that their presence was definitely felt in immigrant communities.
Yeah.
They were doing more enforcement actions, and their definition of who could be detained or deported became much broader.
Yeah.
And that led to this huge increase in fear and uncertainty, even among immigrants who were here legally.
Right.
Our sources mention some pretty concerning reports about people being detained or deported, even students and professionals, some with strong ties to American universities.
Yeah.
And that raised some serious questions about due process and the overall climate for immigrants in the U.S.
Right.
It even had the potential to affect academic freedom and free speech for people in these communities.
And it wasn't just about enforcement within the U.S., right?
No, not at all.
They also started using stricter rules for visa approvals across different categories,
Yeah.
not just the H-1B.
Exactly.
So how did this affect skilled professionals from India and Ethiopia who were trying to come here to work?
Well, it's all about the message the U.S. was sending to the world,
Yeah.
By making the rules tougher for all sorts of visas, they were basically making it harder for skilled professionals from places like India and Ethiopia to come to the U.S. for work.
Oh.
That could mean longer processing times, having to provide way more documents, and a higher chance of being rejected.
Right.
And that ultimately affects the flow of skilled workers into the American workforce.
Yeah, it's not just the H-1B we're talking about.
Right.
It could be things like L1 visas for
Yeah.
intercompany transfers, or even O1 visas for people with extraordinary abilities.
Exactly.
Our sources really emphasize this pervasive feeling of uncertainty around the policies.
Yeah.
It sounds like that in itself had a really big impact, both psychologically and practically.
It definitely did,
What were people experiencing?
Well, with all these constant changes and policies always in flux, people felt incredibly anxious. They didn't know what their rights were or what their future in the U.S. might hold.
Yeah.
They were worried that the way they came here might suddenly not be an option anymore.
Right.
And some people even started looking into moving to countries with more stable immigration systems.
Yeah.
Canada specifically was mentioned a lot as a possible alternative.
And, just to go back to something we touched on earlier, this overall increase in deportations,
Yeah.
it affected people from all over the world,
Right.
including India.
It wasn't just limited to one nationality.
Yeah, it wasn't just limited to one nationality at all.
No.
Okay, so let's wrap up by thinking about some of the broader social and economic consequences of all of these policies.
Okay.
It's not just about the individuals directly affected by,
Yeah.
visa changes or deportations.
It goes way beyond that.
Yeah. What are some of the bigger ripple effects?
Well, if you look at the big picture, These policies really increased tension and made immigrant communities feel marginalized. And on the economic side, tougher visa policies and more deportations could really mess with local job markets,
Yeah.
especially in areas that depend on foreign workers.
No, right.
That economic instability and social unrest, those are things we have to pay attention to.
Yeah, and it's important for you guys listening to understand these economic consequences because they directly affect the communities you live in and the whole country's economy.
Right.
And it's also important to remember that what happens domestically with these policies can affect international relations too, right?
Absolutely. Immigration policies aren't just internal issues.
Yeah.
They can put a strain on relationships with other countries, especially the ones whose citizens are being impacted.
Right.
And how the U.S. handles immigration can affect its reputation globally and influence all sorts of geopolitical stuff.
Yeah. And on a more basic level, limiting the entry of skilled professionals like some of these policies did.
Yeah.
That can directly affect the U.S. economy too.
It's fascinating to think about the potential long-term consequences for innovation and, our ability to compete on a global scale.
Right.
If we make it harder for talented people from all over the world to contribute to the U.S. economy, we could end up hurting our own economic growth and development.
Yeah. Okay, so to sum up our deep dive today, it's clear that the Trump administration's immigration policies led to some pretty big changes and challenges for Indian and Ethiopian immigrants.
Yeah.
We saw impacts on important visa programs like the H-1B, an increase in deportations, and this widespread feeling of uncertainty that affected people's daily lives and their plans for the future.
Mm-hmm.
These policies also had wider social and economic consequences here in the U.S., and they even had implications for our relationships with other countries.
That's a great summary. It's important to remember that these weren't just policy changes on paper.
Right.
They actually had a really big impact on individuals, families, and whole communities.
Yeah, and that brings us to our final thought for you guys to consider.
Okay.
Given all these big shifts in immigration policy and all the different ways they affected things, what do you think the long-term implications are for, the social and economic fabric of the U.S.? And how might these policies change the relationship between the U.S. and important global partners like India and Ethiopia in the years to come? It's complicated.
Yeah, it is.
But we hope this deep dive has given you a clearer understanding of what's going on.
I hope so.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
See you next time.
Take care.